It's really nice to see, lots of old friends back here again and a lot of new ones. We use this as an opportunity, like Kavita said, to really look critically at where the country is and where particular states and programs and processes are. It is a fair and frank discussion. I think a number of people are going to be coming in. At the moment we have a lot of our fellows here. We're very glad that they're able to join us because, in some senses, many of us have done what we can do. We've left quite a mess in some ways. A lot of our younger colleagues are now having to pick that up and try to get to grips with the interconnected range of challenges that we have both inside India and otherwise, whether it's climate change at one end, or dealing with inequality, or dealing with questions of stratification, or the huge challenge that India is facing just now in terms of economic development and growth. So what I'm going to try and do today is try and bring together some of the work that we do, and of course this is not rocket science, it's fairly straightforward kind of things, to try and give us a high level overview so we're able to see with evidence where India potentially stands, where our states stand, and then I think it gives us a little bit of context of where our discussions will take place over the next couple of days. And I try and do this to to show us that it's possible sometimes, even in a relatively poor data environment like India. India used to have one of the best statistical systems in the world, but those of us who've been working on it for a long time know that we're struggling just now. It's kind of falling apart in many places and it's being demolished in others. So we try and use public data to try and show us what we have, but there are many limitations to doing that. So, and of course evidence-based policy is a nice word, but the practice of evidence-based policy is sort of tailing off very dramatically for many of us who work inside government and with government over the years. And I think that may be, to be very frank, one of the reasons that we're having a whole range of challenges, because if you don't have evidence that you can actually track and you can debate about in such a diverse environment like ours, in such a difficult world, then anybody's opinion sort of works. And especially if that translates into political practice where evidence doesn't help, then you have a different environment to work with. So I mean, we strongly are focused on looking at evidence, and of course there are many issues with evidence also. Science itself has many limitations, but that's the fundamental way that we try and look at things, and I'm going to try and show you how we can do stuff and figure out what's happening. So the last year, those of you who were here, we had done a piece of work that tried to benchmark India's performance across states on this thing called the Sustainable Development Goals. We have a new report that builds on that. OMA's just produced something a little while ago that looks at SDG 11. This one looks at all of them. It's here, and there are a few copies that are around. This is where the evidence is. It's put together. It's been put together by my colleagues who are hiding somewhere in the back. Gargi and Amir and Rahel and Raki, etc. So I'm going to present the work that they put together. So the key challenge for us is we are at a pretty tough time at the moment in India. I mean, those of us who've seen it, again, there's a number of economists in the room. My sense is that we are certainly as challenged as we were in 2008 when the crisis hit, and at that point of time we were, at least from the macroeconomic point of view, able to sort of pull out of it. India was sort of used that as a catapult in some ways to deal with a whole range of challenges, but we're at least as bad as that. We might be as bad as 1997, 98, where again we had a serious recession in the country. The industrial sector was hurting very badly. And why am I saying this? Because people don't realize it, but cities are at the center of this process, or at least the big challenge that we're having, and I'll show you some of the data, and many of us know this from our work, and that is that the the urban-rural continuum, in some senses, many of the connections are breaking down. And we're finding huge distress in many parts of the world. Those of us who work, parts of the country, those of us who work on the ground in many places are experiencing this. But we are unfortunately not able to put together a very clear picture because, things are kind of fragmented in at least in the discourse as far as that's concerned. Thankfully, at the current point of our time, for those of us who work on climate and especially on mitigation, we're in a regime where oil prices are relatively low. The oil prices are at somewhere between $60-70 per barrel. I guess the question for us is, if oil prices were higher, how bad would things be? And that's an important question, because one of the big challenges we have in India today is not only to deal with questions of poverty, which is our central concern, inequality, which is now growing because of the massive growth spurt we've seen for the last 30 years, and the increasing sort of concentration of wealth and income with some people and less with others, because our basic services and poverty thing has not worked. But also this question of an economic system which is based on many of the ideas of the 20th century, and the world requires something very different. I mean, many of us are working here at the moment on a major piece of work to try and look at how much climate finance is required across the world. And even though India has made dramatic strides, and we can see that in renewables and a whole range of other things, we are not doing anywhere near what we should be doing. And because of that, and because of the fact that we're one of the largest populations at risk in the world, we are in deep trouble. And you can see that in the crisis in agriculture. So there's a crisis in the agrarian system in India, which is very deep at the moment. Part of it is structural, and we've known that for a long time, and we've tried to avoid it by doing many things, starting with the Green Revolution and many other stuff. But now I would say, for those of us who work on migration, who work in central India, people who work on natural resources and livelihoods, there are literally hundreds of millions of people at risk. And we are seeing that happening. The farmer suicides is just one element of that process. But even for other people, people in small towns, people in large metropolitan centers, because we are not being able to make the shift into a new productive economy, which is powered by a whole range of different things, including renewables, we have a deep problem. So we're working on parts of the process, and we're doing quite well on some things, but on the aggregate, we have some deep systemic challenges. So, I mean, that's what I'm going to try and show you today, that I think we have to focus very clearly on looking at some of the deep structural causes and trying to make sure that there is convergence that takes place rather than divergence. And if we don't do that, we're going to be in a much worse situation than we are. Of course, I guess the good thing in India is that if you have a really bad crisis, it sometimes leads to good things. The problem is, with a population of 1.3 billion people, a bad crisis can affect 300-400 million people. And especially if they're the most vulnerable, it's terrible for all of us, but it also will lead to much more significant instability. And instability is not a good thing in a large population of this size. I mean, frankly, to be honest about this, nobody in all of history has tried to democratically manage a country of India's scale and size, and do that for a decent amount of time. So this is an unprecedented experiment in some senses. And why are these things shifting? I did something here? Yeah. Okay. No, what are you doing? Just bring it back to the center, please, the main thing. So we're in an unprecedented time in some senses, because we embraced globalization in the 90s, or at least some of us did. Our metropolitan cities did in some ways. But that's not working for a whole range of people. And we see that in our politics, we see that in our governance. And I think we really have to sort of re-examine how things are actually working. And the economic question, of course, is central, because we are just not able to create the livelihoods that we need to. And this is a challenge that we face with all of our young people. We're now actually starting to work in the education spaces now. We work in the higher education space, but now we're looking at other things. This is one of the most significant challenges that we have. We're just completely unable to provide old-style livelihoods, the kind of stuff that we did in the public sector and the government, etc., which is no longer viable in some senses, or even the new, gig economy that many of our colleagues here work on to try and understand what's happening. We're just unable to do that. So, while we are very upbeat, and India is seen differently in the world than it was a little while ago, these challenges are extremely severe, and we do need to address them, because again, for a country of the scale and size, momentum is not good enough to take you forward. You really have to deal with these things. Can I have those things back, please? Yeah. Sorry. We're good? Okay. So I'm going to use both these screens just to give you a sense of what's happening. So the frame that we're going to use is not a great frame, but it's a workable frame at the moment. Some of you know about this. This is Sustainable Development Goals. There's 17 of them. Many of us were involved in trying to frame them. In fact, Goal 11 was negotiated partially or framed in this room many years ago. This is a framework which is interesting, not because of anything else, but because it was politically negotiated. Now, that's it. It's like, in a sense, this is a voluntary process. It was like, in a sense, writing a constitution. Because when we negotiated this, it took 2.5 years in the UN to do that. We had all the countries of the world inside the process. And why did it happen? It happened, at least in my appreciation. Of course, there's the Millennium Development Goals. Those of us who've done that kind of stuff have seen it, trying to deal with development across the world. But this happened, I think, for two reasons. And I'm going to be talking about the politics of this. The first was the 2008 crisis, which led to the recession that we've seen across the world, which are not completely out at the moment. In fact, we may be deepening in some senses. Global growth is actually declining at the moment. That was a very strong driver, because after the 1990s, when we had the so-called peace dividend, the end of the Soviet Union, a unipolar world, and people had declared victory in some senses over a whole range of things. We suddenly found a situation where the largest economy in the world, and I was literally on Wall Street the day the crash happened, was in deep crisis, and that contagion spread from the housing sector in the US to the entire financial sector. From there it went to Europe, and you had the IMF working in Greece and Spain and Italy. Kind of a little bit interesting, because in India we still think of the IMF as somebody who did not so good things to us in the 1990s. At least some of us think that way, right? And then you see OECD countries dealing with this kind of question, and all the really bad things that can happen. Deep unemployment, social unrest. I mean, if you see all the stuff from Greece and all that kind of stuff that's there. So that was one driver. The second driver was, in private conversations, because we've talked to a lot of the negotiators there, was the so-called Arab Spring. The hope that suddenly you can change. Again, this is rhetoric. This is the difference between what political science textbooks and papers some of us write and the reality. That something could actually change in a part of the world that has been deeply challenged in many ways. And of course, irrespective of Huntington and all that kind of stuff, there are cultural differences between some parts of the world and the other. So those were the two drivers, plus the fact that the private sector was really hurting. And they were looking for within quotes, business opportunities, fine. So of course there was an early rhetoric in the early 2000s about questions of, the billions of dollars we made at the bottom of the pyramid and stuff like that. So there were a whole range of things that aggregated into this. And there was an understanding that there was something really wrong with the world system, and something needed to be done about it. And it was fascinating, at least, and this is my own personal experience, that at one end you have the Security Council. This is inside the UN building, literally 50 meters away from where this negotiation is taking place, and they're dealing with Syria and Libya and all kinds of other stuff. And here, quite surprisingly, people from across the world, all the countries, because it's country governments, it's a club, the UN is a club in some senses, were sitting and saying, look, we better do something different. It was led by a particular set of countries. So that process, in which India was also a part, there was a shift of government that happened just before the end of that thing, led to a framework which is very messy. When we tried to design it in the beginning, we said, okay, 10 goals, so it's simple. If children can count it on 10 fingers, it's good and you can remember it. But it became very messy. But the fact is, and we're struggling with it just now, many of us were at the General Assembly just a few months back, to try and see what this means. So if I look at the goals, and I'll do this very quickly for those of you who haven't heard this before, there's some goals that have been with us for 150 years. So the early goals, 1 and 2, for example, you go back to Marx, Engels, etc., etc. You go back to the big social revolutions, the bigger revolutions of the 20th century. They're about these questions that are there. Fine. There are another set of goals which came to us after the war in some senses. They are in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which India was a part of, 1948. So you have health, education, all the stuff that we've been doing for 60, 70 years just now. And then there are other ones which are much more insidious and more difficult to deal with. Gender equality. Gender equality almost derailed the negotiations. The negotiations went over for a day and a half, and they nearly failed on the question of gender equality. So because many countries said, you guys, other countries, are trying to force your will on us. This is not our culture, this is not the way that we work. But the interesting thing about this framework is, it assumes that every individual across the world has a right to some basic things. And again, we have internal contests about this stuff in the country at the moment. But that's the fundamental frame on which it's based. So gender equality was a deeply contested goal. The other one that was actually complicated was the question of climate change. So when we negotiated this thing, we did not believe that there would be an agreement on climate. There was an endless process that had gone on. Copenhagen had failed, things didn't work. So the climate goal is extremely weak. So the goal is very weak because the Paris Agreement that came just after this happened in September, that happened in December, people didn't believe that it would close. Fine. And then the other one that I think created a lot of challenges for us, and that was goal 11, the one that Holmes just produced stuff on. There was a big pushback. Chandrika was there. We were part of this whole discussion at that point of time, which basically said if you have an urban goal, you have to have a rural goal. This framing of spatiality and territoriality didn't work for most people. Why? Because for 150 years or more, national governments have been organized from the time of the French and the British and whatever it is stuff that we picked up. Along each of these things, you can see a department there. You can see when you say women and child development, you can see all, they're basically structured in silos. But actually in the 21st century world, or even the 20th century world, the idea of space and spatial inequality and a whole range of other processes is a new idea. It's not the way that countries have liked to be organized, because many of them have been formed through centralizing processes. That's what nationalism helped do to us, etc. The reason I'm laying this out is I think the big battle we are fighting at the moment, I mean, some of us are in 10 days time are in Durban for the UCLG Congress, the first sort of Congress of mayors across the world. There is a contest that's starting to take place. It's becoming heightened just now between national governments and local governments. I mean, we've had this in India in any case, When the constitution was written, it was, there were two parts, part 1, part 2, center and state coming to us from the 1935 Act and stuff like that. And then in 1993-94, we created 73rd and 74th Amendments. Fine, so we created the third tier, and there's ongoing contests in that space, and many of us have written about this and worked on this. But the idea that we have to, if we have to achieve this agenda, actually inform vertical and horizontal partnerships was a difficult and revolutionary idea. So in some senses, the member states were saying, okay, we might want to do some horizontal work. We'll try and tie up education with health and, whatever it is, climate with air pollution, all this other kind of stuff that's there. But to do that spatially is deeply challenging. But the fact is that if you don't do that spatially in our context, in India and otherwise, you can't implement this stuff. Like we're saying just now. I mean, this is exactly what happened in the General Assembly. We were saying, okay, you've got 200 countries here. You guys can't implement this stuff. We've got 4,000 days to deliver this thing. How the hell can you do this? It's not possible to deliver this agenda. Universal coverage, fine. So inside this agenda, and I'll do this very quickly because we'll go on to the data just now, are three very challenging ideas. The first idea is that no one should be left behind. Okay, I don't know how that slipped through the negotiations. I think it was the Latin Americans who did it. I mean, I know who did it, but I'm saying it's something that's really surprising. In an international negotiation where you fight about everything under the sun, you blame everybody else, the fact that you could, this idea of leaving no one behind, which in a sense, in some ways is a deeply subcontinental idea. It goes to Antarctica, a whole range of things that are there. But something else that we wrote in insidiously into Goal 11, the idea of leaving no place behind. That's, when you bring these two ideas together, you have a fundamentally challenging way of dealing with this thing. So you're saying, how do you deal with inequality? In terms of class, caste, gender, race, etc., etc. How do you deal with spatial inequality? And I think this is our fundamental challenge today. We're not able to address questions of spatial inequality because part of the process of liberalization has meant that we've thrown everything that we had, some of it was stupid, before 1991, out of the window. So there's real actual spatial inequality both at between the states. There's divergence, we've known that, the literature has said this for a long time, between districts within urban areas. This is exactly what many of us work on. And if that divergence continues at the rate of growth that we have, we're going to have trouble. And then finally, the big realization, and there are many of us who work on this thing, I was just speaking to Jagdish just now about this, is that all of this stuff doesn't make any sense at all if the ecosystem services don't work. And we know as we're entering a 1.5, 2, 3, 4, 5 degree world, that this stuff is kind of going to fall apart. Of course, there are some sort of little bit over the top reports about Bombay going underwater and stuff like that. And disappearing. I mean, not all of that will happen exactly in the same way, but the basic thing is ecosystem services are in deep trouble in this country, along with the challenge in agriculture and forestry and land-based livelihoods, and of course the huge crisis as far as surface and groundwater is concerned. If you don't have these services to run, whether it's in forests or any other kinds of land, or even for cities, the city is in deep trouble as far as this is concerned. You have a deep problem. So the challenge for us is, in an earlier view of the world, you could do each of these things separately. We talked about optimization. Many Nobel Prizes have been won in this space. I try and fix this and do X, Y, and Z. But the fact is, we've run out of time. We have to do all of these things together if we want even second best outcomes. And that is the real challenge, which means that you really have to think in, within quotes, revolutionary ways. And it cannot be ideological. It has to be based on evidence, because if you don't do that, you will do 3 things well, and you'll do 4 things badly, and the other ones won't work at all, and the whole thing will be a mess. Now, historically, India's done very well in the mess, but this is a mess that we're not going to survive, unfortunately. So that's the bad news. The good news is, a quick ranking. So this is the same framework. There's been systematic work done to prioritize that. We have colleagues all over the world doing this thing. This largely comes from the work from SDSN. Essentially, what I'm going to do here is very, very quickly is to show you a frame and see how we can look at the evidence. So this is Sweden, which is number 1 on the Sustainable Development Index. There are many indices in the world. I picked up a few of them. Top right-hand side is the Human Development Index. This is what Mehbul Haq, Amartya Sen, etc. produced. So that shows you what needs to be done in human development. On the top is the original framing that goes back to a whole range of great economists. That's a GDP per capita, so it gives you a sense of where the country is. On the bottom left is biocapacity, which is this really challenging thing we don't talk about very much. So I've used a comparative indicator, not the best one in the world, which is the global hectares per capita. The thing in brackets there is actually the biodiversity index. So we're using 2 different things to look at what's happening. Thankfully, we have a pretty good report in that space, and population, fine. Okay, so what else do we see here? We see this, which brings all the goals together. So the same goals, 1 to 17, poverty, no poverty, no hunger, good healthcare, good education, gender equality, water and sanitation, affordable and clean water, economic growth, infrastructure, etc., and goal 11 there. This looks at all of them, starting with SDG 1 to 17. It goes all the way around. 100 means you've actually reached there. Yeah. So if you look at Sweden, for example, pretty obvious. Per capita GDP sitting at 50,000 plus. You'll have a fraction there, but very small numbers. But if you look at Sweden also here, very interesting thing. This is what you find for many OECD countries. On hunger, there's serious issues. Not because people are calorie hungry. They don't have the same challenges that we have, but you have a huge nutrition question here. And there's a nutrition crisis. All the health people in the room will tell you this. In pretty much all the OECD countries, you see them again and again and again, because we're consuming food that we should not consume. Obesity is a huge problem. There are many issues of diabetes, etc. So this is not just whatever it is, X number of kilocalories per day. It's a whole range of other things. So you'll see that again and again. 3 and 4, obviously, if you look at Sweden healthcare, this is the great social democratic revolution of Sweden. On 5, even Sweden has issues on gender equality. Right? Again, one of the most equal, most strident countries in this space. So this is, in a sense, the most advanced country in trying to get to the SDGs. In a sense, if arriving at where you want to is actually filling up this whole thing. So you see on the environmental dimensions, 14, 15, climate also, Sweden has done quite well. They've done many things in that space to do whatever it is. On 12, they're not doing very well. And if you go to Swedish cities and you see, in every household or you find recycling in 5 different buckets, sometimes 7 of them. So you say, wow, they're doing well. But in aggregate, they're still not doing okay. So basically what we're saying is, this gives you a sense of how well you're doing. This tells you how you are. So the reds basically means that there are major challenges. So in sustainable production and consumption, there are major challenges for Sweden, also for climate. The sort of oranges here mean there's significant challenges. This is about peace, justice, and strong institutions. Many countries across the world are struggling. But this is a big difference, both in the global report and the one that I'll show you just now that we're talking about. And that is, are you on track? If you want to get to this by 2030, if you want this to happen in 4,000 days, are you on track? Now, of course, data sources are very difficult to compare across the world. It's messy. We use linearizations here for all the guys who work on methods. This is not the best way of doing it, but it gives us a sense of how well you're going. So, are you on track? If you're up and going green, are you moderately improving? Are you going towards your target? Are you decreasing? Sweden is not having any of that, of the kind of things, or you're stagnating. So on questions of life below water, questions of dealing with both aquatic and marine life. There are some issues there, obviously for a whole range of other reasons. So that's a snapshot of a country, for whatever it's worth. I'm going to flag this to say, look, it's possible for us to do these kind of things in our country also to a certain extent. So that's Germany, fine. So just to give you a sense of things, Germany is doing better on some things than Sweden, but it has, so if you can see, there are more greens in Germany than in Sweden. Per capita income is slightly lower, HDI is good, but they have a huge biocapacity challenge there compared to Sweden. That's the United Kingdom, which is going through tremendous political turmoil, and you can see some of that in some of the ongoing things they're dealing with. For example, if you look at gender equality here, you see ongoing challenges here. If you look at inequality here, and this is, let's say, a Boris effect in some senses. Inequality is one of the key drivers of the politics that you have regionally and otherwise in the UK. But again, UK's per capita incomes are high HDI, big issues on biocapacity. It's an island in some senses, 67 million people. Of course, if you start comparing to states, these are like states in India. I mean, what's a big deal as far as that's concerned? That's Japan. Again, interesting, slowing economy. So you're seeing them, a divergence taking place at about $40,000 per capita, 127 million people. So almost twice the size of the UK in some senses. Obviously, serious biocapacity challenges, and they're doing pretty well for what they're doing. But you can see the stuff. Those of us who know Japan, gender equality, even inequality questions. Look at this. Yeah, inequality in Japan here. Then they're not doing well at all. The economic situation that they're having and how they deal with people from the outside and trade is not that easy. This is, in a sense, if you look at the rise of particular political leaderships, you can see some of these trends. If you just keep looking at 10, you will see, and if I correlated who, in a sense, the political leaders are, you get some sense of process. This is something that often surprises people. Largest economy in the world, very high per capita GDP. Of course, big challenges about whether they can maintain it, whether the next generation is going to have life as well as the American dream would try and deal with it. But if you look at the reds here, look at the reds, just all over the place. So hunger, big issue in the US. Gender equality, inequality, production and consumption, climate change, peace, conflict, partnership. So the US is not doing well, and if you look at this process, you're seeing they're in some trouble on all these factors there. These are structural factors in some senses. You can see what's actually happening, and that this is a classic indicator around 10. 10 really shows you what's actually happening. And of course, even for a continental economy of its size, the biocapacity issues are very, very serious. The US has been living beyond its budget, its ecological budget now for almost 30 years or more. But of course, the great opportunity they have is this 300 million plus people that's there. Australia, again, another very, very big island. Many issues because they're islands in some senses. China, the big one. China is, the economy, the country that's actually changed the world in the last 30 years or so. And, we are both envious, and we're also challenged in trying to think of China. Look at China's situation. So obviously a lot worse than many of the other OECD countries. So, if you look under the area of the curve, but all of these operational challenges, 2, 3, but they've done many things in the area of 4. So education is one thing in which China has done remarkably well compared to us, of course, healthcare. We started very similarly maybe 40 years ago. Big issues in this space, and of course environmental challenges. We're now trying to challenge China with air quality at the moment. So we're trying to beat China, capital for capital, sorry. So Brazil, look at inequality in Brazil. In fact, those of us who look at these questions, the question for us now as a middle income country is, can we break out of the middle income trap? Will we become another South Africa? Will we become another Brazil? But a Brazil with 6 times that population. Okay, and we've seen how Brazil is swung in the last few years and all the challenges that they're having at the current point of time. So again, you can see lots of reds and browns and many, many challenges on that side. That's Saudi Arabia. I put this in there because most of us don't think of the Saudis as a player in the game. But when you start looking at climate, the Saudis are a very key player in the process. They are actually the fulcrum on which the system may actually tip in terms of whether we're going to make the transition or not. So obviously, there's not a lot of lack of data. There are many issues as far as that's concerned, and there are many things. For example, there is no data on on inequality in Saudi Arabia. Obviously, biocapacity is a big issue, but they are pivotal countries in that sense. This is something that, when I showed this in Nepal to a public meeting where there were a lot of people, including the Prime Minister was there, we had that, there was a roar. because, and I'll show it to you in a second, in some ways, and this is very interesting for us, Nepal is doing better than India. And for a country that was blockaded in some senses, we stopped the oil supplies, we stopped a whole range of things. I mean, we forget this thing, that we are a great country, we are Gandhians, we do various things up there. Very challenged country, post-earthquake, just 28 million people. So, this is almost the size of one of our large cities. Delhi, Mumbai are coming to the size of that country. In many things, of course, partially because of the level of development, Nepal is actually doing a lot better, in spite of all the operational challenges, the big political challenges that are there. So a lot of the young people really laughed because, if you look at that, that's South Africa. That's just a little bit worse in the ranking. That is 100 and something. This is 107. Very unequal country here, and here we are. We're at 112 for a country that's very obsessed with all of these indicators, and we focus on just a few because they sound cool and whatever it is, and they're important in some sense. So we think they're important. We're not doing well at all, and this is relatively objective data. The good news, of course, is that some things are moving, and I'm going to then dive into this and look at this in much more detail just now. So that is just giving you a sense of where we are. So things have changed. We've gone through 30 years of liberalization. Our GDP per capita has grown. We were doing almost 7-8% growth, and now of course we're in a different situation just now. So many things have changed, but a lot of things have become much worse. And those of us who work on the ground know that, but we don't have a way of trying to articulate it and trying to see how to keep the balance in some senses. And government struggles, of course, all of us. So this is what we showed you last year. This was a ranking of all the states, into different categories that are there along the goals. The reds are obviously not doing so well. The greens are doing better. So you can see a state like Goa and Delhi, etc. on the top. That's, if I just read them off, that's Goa, Delhi, Kerala, Punjab. These are the normal suspects in some senses, and then of course you have Bihar, UP, Jharkhand, Arunachal, Assam, Odisha at the bottom. So that gives you a snapshot. This thing many of you have seen and used. The big news from last year is we did this for urban areas, okay, and that was a huge challenge. My colleagues did a remarkable piece of work in trying to figure that out and do whatever it was supposed to try and deal with that. So the only reason this is useful is it shows you that you can actually do this. And if urban areas or the process of urbanization is something that drives this, and it may not be, in some places it isn't, it gives you a sense of how things actually are, it gives you a sense of where things are going. So this is last year. Of course, it's based on a lot of underlying data, so we can go in and drill into the particular details, and then you can tie it to schemes and processes. I'm not going to spend time there. The big things that we learned from last year was there were some goals in which urban areas performed better than national averages, and you can see them. That's poverty, that's gender equality, that's water and sanitation, that's energy, and then dealing with partnerships. Okay, in 3-4 other goals, urban areas were not very different from others, and we've known this from the literature. So, food, not surprising, but surprising in some senses, in spite of the PDS, a whole range of other things. Not much difference between urban and rural areas, which means in some senses we can say, oh, our PDS system, our X, Y, and Z is not doing too badly, but the base is very bad. Education. Urban education is not doing very much better than rural education. So, it should not be so. It's against all theories, against what we're doing in many other states, but that's the reality of the data. And then, of course, the big problem for us, growth in jobs. This is the crisis that we're in. We've been in it for a while at the moment. And, of course, inequality. The whole thing that Baba Sahib said, cities are going to give you the praise of dealing with the inequality. That is not working. The evidence on that is pretty clear. We know that from anecdotal stuff, from deep ethnographic stuff, but we also know it from the macro data as far as that's concerned. The surprising thing, of course, is that in health, if you go to Delhi, it's pretty obvious, yeah? Urban areas are doing worse than rural areas. Huge surprise. Our tertiary care hospitals are basically running as OPDs, whatever. The system is not working, and unfortunately or fortunately, there are a few 100 million people in that system. So this is going to reflect on your aggregate statistics, and then a whole range of other things in which we don't actually have good data. A lot of the environmental stuff that needs to help. So things have not changed very much. The only difference just now is we've done a little bit more work, and we can show you what the trends are like. So in that document you see the trends. I'm just going to put it up there just for the sake of putting them up at the moment. So at the state level, nice picture, so don't get confused about what it is. At the state level, and we've done it alphabetically just now, there are many issues and lots of questions. The big thing that I think that's of great concern to us is, you see these lines on poverty? Okay, that's not good. That's not good anywhere. It's certainly not good in our environment. This is a data artifact, I would say, in some senses, because lots of things have happened on water and sanitation, but those of us who work on the full cycle know that if you only do one part of the cycle, it's great, it's fantastic, we haven't done it. But then if the whole system doesn't work, this is a challenge. You can't only optimize in systemic change one part of the process. So we've done great stuff, it's wonderful, but it's not working very well. But the real trend, I think, is the connection between the poverty stuff and this is the infrastructure and jobs dimension, where we're having very, very serious challenges. So we've done the same thing here, and you can see the same thing in urban areas. Again, this is a big issue here. We talked about deepening of poverty in urban areas for a long time. Of course, many of these things are because of lagged indicators. The indicator sets are not good. Like I said when I started, the system is not as good as it is. It should be improving now with all the technology that we have, everything that we have. But it's actually becoming worse. It's becoming really challenging for us to aggregate and see what's happening. And it doesn't matter what country it is, whether it was the Soviet Union or X and Y and Z. Once you start shutting your eyes to your data systems, you can be sure that you're going to have a serious crisis quite soon, because nobody knows what's happening. And in a democratic country, it makes it much more difficult. So some big issues here, especially around education, and in other areas. So this again is based on a lot of underlying trends. You can have a look at it and look at it later. But this is where I'm sort of going to sort of wrap up and open a discussion. So what I've done here with my colleagues is to, now you can see what we've done here is we've taken the states at the aggregate level and we've broken them up into quartiles, or into different cohorts that are there. And this gives you a sense of the performance at the state level, and what's happening in terms of urban India. Just to give you a sense of what there is. There are many issues because the indicator set is deeply problematic. There are a lot of methods issues that are here, but this is poverty line. This is access to latrine within a house. These are proxy indicators in some senses. But this gives us those of us who work in these areas, no big surprise that we have an issue here. Maybe a little bit of a surprise that West Bengal is not doing so well and the Northeast is not okay, and some states are okay and better than others. This is interesting in some ways. This is in terms of the big changes that we are seeing that's there. So if you look at the urban versus rural picture, obviously urban areas are doing better than rural areas. Yeah, and this is an old story. There's so much literature on Kerala. I mean, there's this big debate about Kerala versus other models and stuff like that. So we have a way of starting to, look at these things comparably. Okay, so that's a story on hunger. Sorry, one second. Here, that's the urban story on hunger. Yeah. So you see a lot more differentiation in urban area, and this is stunting and underweight children. So it's NFHS data, not so bad. You see the big challenges that we're having in urban areas compared to rural areas. So lots of progress in some places, but not so much in others. Yeah, that's health. Again, a good deal of differentiation here. Some states, obviously, I mean, you can see the outliers. That's Goa sitting inside here. Some significant shifts happening in some places. Obviously, southern states doing better than others. Some trends as far as that's concerned. Education, big issue here. Big issue here. We're just not able to get this right from the school level upwards. We have this has a huge lagged effect. Gender equality. Here I'm not the indicators are not brilliant, but it still gives you a sense of what's happening. That's water and sanitation. One of the biggest initiatives that we've seen since, I would say since the 1980s and 90s. The big initiative in the 80s was drinking water to villages, and you could see it at the census level. There was a big, massive push. It made a difference. Of course, it's becoming less and less different. Now we have a big change happening in various places, but lots of interesting challenges in that space. This is the one in which we've done very well, partially because of the indicators that we're doing. So it's LPG, lighting, renewables. We've done very well in this, but like many of us can tell you here, and we'll see that in the climate panel, it's just not enough. Making the transition on the renewable side is a great thing we're doing, But we have to get out of coal really, really fast. And how do you get out of coal really fast when you have 250 million people who are not connected to electricity? And you can do as much e-vehicles as you want to. But the fact is, if your grid is coal-based, it doesn't help. And unfortunately, what we're putting out from our coal-fired power plants, of course, is affecting air pollution and a whole range of other things. And the fossil fuel economy, it has horrible challenges for us. We are, as far as oil and gas is concerned, a completely dependent economy. So as much as the Saudis are dependent on oil and gas for their survival, and they're really, really being challenged at the moment, making their structural transformation out of oil and gas into something else. We are challenged on the other side, and this is not a new one. It's been there since the 70s. Every macroeconomist knows this, that your balance of payments, your inflation, everything is tied to your oil bill in some senses. And we don't have much oil, so we've gone to coal. And coal is a really big employer. And we also made sure now that states have a critical share in coal revenues. I think the big, huge structural mistake that we made, a few years ago when the coal block process was shifted. It was not a bad thing that we fixed the coal block process, but it's locked us into a pathway which is really, really challenging. And it's coming back to bite us. Maybe not so much in the monsoon as yet. We have one of the world experts on the monsoon here, but it's coming. And you can see that with the flooding and drought cycles that are there. This is not going to stop, it's going to become worse. So, anybody who has access to a smartphone or whatever it is, whether it's in forest lands, in any place of the country, knows from their own experience, especially if they're connected to the land, that this is not working. We need the energy, absolutely no question about it. We're doing huge things on that, and I think this government has done remarkable things in trying to promote it, unless in the past. But we're not doing it fast enough, and we're not doing the right things in the critical place. So, we're patting our back a lot, and it's good, but it's not going to get us where we want to. In fact, it's going to get us into a pretty unstable space. If we hit 2, the difference between 1.5 and 2 across the world is the difference between 30 million people and 350 million people being food insecure. And a lot of those people are in our country. And this is just models. The reality on the ground is going to be much more difficult to deal with. And once you go beyond 2, and this is the thing that people don't necessarily know, what we've agreed, it's not only India's challenge here, but what we agreed in Paris was a world that went beyond 3. The Paris Climate Agreement has something that are called the National Determined Contributions. We study them, we do a lot of stuff on them. The NDCs are going to take us between 2.7 and 3.2, depending on how you want to look at it. That is a world that is unimaginable. In the short run, in the long run, yes. Bombay will go back to its islands. I mean, that's the big news because real estate is a big issue at the moment. But the fact, in a sense, that's baked in. So you should not be buying real estate along beachfronts anymore, whether it is in Chennai or Bombay or whatever it is, because the sea level rise, in a sense, is baked in. You can't change that. Even if you stopped emissions today, that process is going to continue into the 2100s. So if you're able to look that far in front, that's locked in. But the question is, between now and then, when we have to make this big transition over the next 20, 30 years, in fact, we probably have less to go to 50% reduction. That's what the 1.5 report that we wrote said last year. It said, okay, by 2030, which is now 4,000 days, you have to reduce your emissions globally about 50% which means that India has to negotiate very, very hard for the carbon space to be able to give us the electricity, that give us the jobs, that give us the whatever. That's the reason that we fight so hard about this thing. But irrespective of all of that, we have to get to net zero by 2050. Otherwise, we're going to have an overshoot, and the overshoot is going to be really horrible, and we're going to face it. And our neighbors are going to face it. And I've said this, and the New York Times has misquoted me on this. You can't build walls or barriers or set up identity systems to contain 20 million people moving, or 30 million people, or 50 million people. Okay, both within the country or otherwise. It cannot work. We've never done that. I mean, the Chinese tried this a long time ago, and it worked for 40, 50 years, but it won't work longer than that. It's called the Great Wall. It's a nice thing. People go and walk on it now. But it didn't do its job. You cannot hold people out. That's what Europe is struggling with at the current point of time. So you have to change your way of doing things. You've got to change your behavior. You've got to change what's important to you. You have to ask hard questions. And you've got to get the whole system to change. That's the problem. I mean, all of us have been, very few of us have succeeded, and I think we're very glad to have colleagues in the room who have succeeded in making that whole system change in a small place with 50,000 people, 100,000 people, a district. Fantastic stuff. We have 600 districts. and we don't know how to scale that up quickly enough, and we have very little time. And we've been distracted by a whole range of other things which are maybe important for our identity and our politics and whatever it is, or suppose national security, but are not the core issues. So this is great news, but the great news is also very sobering news in some senses. So this is the hard story. Yeah, we're just not creating the jobs, and we know what's happening here. I mean, if I inverted this and look at migration trends, you'd see what's happening. I mean, the jobs are happening in southern India and other places. This is where the wealth is concentrated. This is where the economic output is concentrated. We really have to create in these two regions here. This is where we have to get the jobs going in manufacturing in small towns. This is where the urban challenge lies. It's in UP, Bihar, Rajasthan, MP, etc. You know, again, the same story. You can't build walls, people will come. Of course, we have a constitutional guaranteed right to be able to come or move or whatever it is. But in practice, when you have a country that's big as Europe, you have to address that question. It doesn't work, and you know, we're being challenged in dealing with that. Inequality, of course, you know, great story. That's the driver, yeah? Look at that side there. So yeah, I mean, some of these are data artifacts. There may be issues with some things that are there. Okay, so that's not good news on that side. This, of course, is an endogenous variable. So you know, whatever. This doesn't make much sense. These Om is the expert on this. He's got a. Yeah. I mean, there are lots of debates on this. So this is not sort of very useful. In fact, I think the challenge that we're having, and this is an invitation to everybody here, is we've tried and we've struggled here as an institution, and many of us have tried to try and do a bottom up. So you know, we have people from Hyderabad Urban Lab, etc., etc. Can we do this from city level upwards? The challenge is that we've systematically made sure from the statistics side, from the 74th Amendment side, that we are unable to collect these things and figure that out. So you know, whether it's in public finance or X and Y and Z, we need this very obviously. You know, if you have a tax base and most of your tax comes from certain places, you better have a good tax database for that place, otherwise you're never going to fix it. If much of the economic growth and a lot of economic development, and now the new product that we have, which is called inequality, is coming from these places, you better know something about it. Because if you don't know something about it, then you're in trouble. And of course, a whole range of other things. This is climate action, just very quickly. Some states are doing better than others. This is largely driven by renewables. Life on land, we have better data. Again, it's a little bit crazy because we couldn't find decent proxies on this, on that. We have nothing on water. We don't have good data on aquatic life or life on water. These are proxies. These are, you know, there are many issues about how the NCRB looks at stuff. So I would take this with a pinch of salt, but we need much more research and work in this space. This is absolutely critical. There were certain institutions that did this kind of work. We need granular data at the city scale. We need granular data here at you know, at the district scale, because as administrators, as people who are working in development or as academics, unless we have data on this, the institutions are the heart of the process. The fulcrum sits around them. If you're not able to do something on this, then we have some issues. So obviously some things are better than others. And by and large, the good thing that India has always survived around is the fact that we have so much diversity that there are not too many fires at the same time. You know, typically we've had 2 fires at the same time and we managed it. Now we're setting fires in many places. The second thing is, because there's so much diversity, there's always something good happening in somewhere or the other, and that tends to carry. The challenge is the structural factors that are inhibiting that are becoming sometimes more than otherwise. And if the macroeconomy, the macro polity, and the macro ecological situation is pushing back against you, then we have some problems. And that's what, you know, I don't want to leave you with a not very nice taste in your mouth in some senses. But that's the challenge that we have. So lots and lots of really good things happening at the micro level, some big things happening at the macro level, very little connections between the two across levels, and almost no horizontal connections. The most obvious things, you know, you need to obviously have food security, but that's dependent on ecological security at the same time. Disconnection. The connection between food security and nutrition security and health, disconnection. Yeah. And then the connection between that and quality of life, disconnection. We're working in silos. We know that this is a systems problem. And you know, the question for us is, how can we take those things where the connections actually happen at local level? Great work happening inside government, inside the private sector, in some other places, and pull that together. This has been a constant refrain that we've had here, and I think we found wonderful solutions. I mean, this thing is not about problems. The opening session is about, oh guys, this is where we are, so that we have the big picture. But the real discussion that we have here is about solutions and trying to see how to make them work, and not declaring victory when you've succeeded in dealing with 1/6 of a big problem, because it's a systemic issue. You can deal with one bit, you can get toilets fixed, that's great, but if you don't deal with the entire chain, that's cool, but you're going to have a problem in a few years' time. So we have to change the way that we do things, we have to change the way that we think about things, we have to change the way in which policy is made and how practice is organized. And I think that's the spirit in which we open this dialogue. I don't want to, close with a very negative tone, but this is a difficult time. And India has, and we've seen this, whether it's 91, various other things that happened in the 90s, in the 2000s, etc., where you see a dip. And I can tell you, we've not gone as badly as we will go in the next year, year and a half, 2 years, or whatever it is. But we really, in that dip, have to find the way of pulling out. And it can only be done by people on the ground. And that's the interesting thing. It's not us guys who are sitting in the room or playing with models or talking about other things that work on it. We have to make that connection. And I think the democratization of process, the reorganization of discourse, making those connections is very important for us to do. And that's why, in some senses, I think education is going to be the critical driver. We have remarkable new tools to do that now. We can reach out to lots and lots of people. Many changes are happening, but in everything that we do, they're both sides. You have social media which can reach 50 million people in whatever 30 seconds or whatever it is. But on the other side, you find social media doing really odd things which are pushing back against that. So we need to keep the balance. We have to use science and evidence and a clear understanding of how to make systemic change on the ground and bring people together to build institutions which we've forgotten to build. I mean, that's one of the core challenges that we've had. India has been pretty good at building institutions in the 50s and 60s and whatever it is. And then we forgot and we let them decay. And then we did a lot of stuff in one dimension, which is on economics, but not enough. We did all the easy reforms. And now you're finding everything else falling apart because we didn't pick up the hard reforms, the power sector reform, the banking system reform, and X and Y and Z. Large country, lots of things happening. Things will go their own way. And if you don't have checks and balances, things will become more difficult later than otherwise, and some people will get left out. So the institutional challenge is very severe and real. And I think the challenge for us is not only to rebuild the institutions that we built, which are constitutional and otherwise, it is to create new ones that can do the kind of work that we're talking about. So defending what we have, building on them, building the connects that are there. There are many people in government who've been doing this through their lives to make that happen. I mean, of course, this country is owned by the citizens of the country, not by one set of people or the other. That, I think, is the fundamental challenge that we have, and that's the only way forward. And that's the reason why many of us work so hard at innovation on the ground, at education, because it is the people who will change the institutions that make the sense. And getting a sense of how this works is important because that's how things change. It's through people, through institutions, and through a whole range of democratic processes in which you can have significant differences, political views on economics. That's fine. That's perfectly okay. But you have to have those discussions because these challenges are not going to go away. It's not like the 70s where you would want to say Garibi Hatao and do something else and you play one thing against the other. You cannot manage a system of this scale with the kind of trends that you have by doing piecemeal stuff. You can fool a lot of people for a while, but not forever, because the ground realities are going to burn you up. So, I mean, having said that, I really want to thank my colleagues who've actually done this work and allowed us to see the kind of things that we're talking about just now. There's much more work that needs to be done. We need to have stuff like this for every block in the country. And notionally today it should be possible to do. We have the technology, we have huge data, we have data on every person in this country. But we're not able to do that and do that in a transparent way where people can say, hey, what's happening here? Can we change this? Oh, wow, wonderful. Let's see how we can move this somewhere else. And I hear a lot of wonderful things, but the coming together is the big challenge. So thank you so much. And we can sort of, if I haven't depressed you too much, we can have a conversation.
Thank you, Aro. And thank you for showing the comparison between countries. I just want to make one point on the international comparisons, which is that for a lot of the low-income countries, we'll see them right now doing very well on goal 13 because carbon emissions per capita are very low. So you'll see over time that those trends will worsen. But as of now, you would expect all of them to do well. So that's not actually a good picture. I mean, it shows them doing well on goal 13, but that doesn't mean very much. So that's kind of one.
Yeah, I agreed with you. I mean, this is Nepal's issue on
Right.
consumption.
Right.
Because Nepal produces very little waste. It's like India like 30 years ago.
Right.
So you have a recycling economy because there are a lot of kabadiwalas and you don't see it. There's not too much of plastic there. That doesn't mean that Nepal is doing great, but the question is,
Right.
do you have a system to measure it or not?
Right.
Yeah.
So you do measure it, but I think that's where the trends become important because as they get, and also progress on one goal then automatically tells you you're going to do worse on some of these other ones. So that's one. The second is that, as we're in the spirit of what you were saying of getting out of the pit that we're finding ourselves in, given that manufacturing is at a low, given that there is this crisis in the private sector, is there any work that you're aware of that's looking at thinking about resetting with a decarbonized frame? So looking at sectors, looking at industries which are from starting built in a decarbonized way. Is that something that's happening? Is that even a topic of discussion? Because it's seen that's the opportunity that you were referring to. We are in a crisis, but this is one way of getting out of it.
So let me take one industry. Of course, I'm not a specialist in it. There may be other people who are better than I. If I take the textile industry, which has been a historical industry for India for 2,500 years in some senses. Textiles, or let's say the Palum sector, for example, which has created a fair amount of employment, is one of the ways out of this challenge. And we know that because Bangladesh has done this. I mean, if you look at the big shift that's taken in Bangladesh, you go to Dhaka and see it. Other countries like the Philippines have done this in many ways. We are in a very interesting situation. Per capita income slightly higher than Bangladesh, getting our industry is kind of wiped out by what's happening. I mean, Bangladesh and West Bengal, if you compare them, that's a great counterfactual in some senses. So that's one industry that I imagine that you could very quickly move to a decarbonized system. I mean, we're not here, but my colleague, we're starting to build our campus, and we're doing a campus. One has also stepped out just now, which is run completely on photovoltaics. Okay, so we'll be net positive in terms of energy. We'll be zero carbon. In fact, we'll try and sequester carbon on carbon. And why are you doing that? Because you're mixing high technology. In the case of Palooms, it means really efficient motors, which are not dependent on a grid that is giving you 120 volts instead of 220 volts on it, burning out the motors and doing other kind of stuff that's there. So the technology in some senses is known to be able to make that transition. But in textiles, it's not only the question of getting the Palooms to be more efficient, it's the entire supply chain and making sure that, if you get 50 million people, or in Bengal was the before, I mean, 18th century, it was the heart of textile manufacturing for the world. I'm just giving thought experiment there. If you're able to get, like Bangladesh has got done, if you get garment manufacturing up in Bengal that produces employment for 10 million people, or not 10, let's say 5 million people or so, you have to have your supply chains to be able to get it to your domestic markets, A, B, to international markets. But our domestic market is so large in many of these cases, especially even in textiles, where the volume of stuff that we are importing from other parts of the world. I mean, our mercantile trade deficit with China is like horrendous and huge and growing. That's one classic example where you can start the decarbonization, but you've got to decarbonize the entire supply chain also. It's also the transportation, it's how you work the logistics and stuff like that. Now, unfortunately, the guys who do work on renewables, the people who do work on textiles, people who work on design, and the financing institutions are not having a conversation around this. I mean, I took a very stupid and simple example of how this can be done. Similarly, those of us who work in the agriculture sector, solar pumps. Some of us see it as a great way forward, or it could be a horrible adaptation, because what's actually happening, the pump will run, it will give you, within quotes, clean, low energy water, but because you have no groundwater control regimes, the rich guys who can afford the pump will basically do what they're doing, so it will become a tragedy of the commons. So that's another example. You have to absolutely decarbonize the agricultural sector, make sure that water efficiency is like dramatically improved as far as that's concerned, both surface and ground, which is much more complicated than doing just surface. And then you've got to make sure that you decarbonize the entire chain, including dealing with food loss. Because the big story from the IPCC land report is food wastage, and all of that is FCI and all the down, what nonsense that we throw out because we eat too much, because some people do that, is very large. It's, maybe a third of your emissions come from that entire chain. So this connecting of dots is quite simple, kids get this, is not happening because we're all doing this. That's the issue. And we're doing a lot of great innovation hubs, tinkering this, that, the other, but on a simple thing like this, like let's say Korean did with milk, take the entire supply chain, give somebody 5 years and fix it in UP or Bihar or whatever it is, or whatever, anywhere else. I mean, Tirupur is here. You know the story of Tirupur, we have colleagues from here who work on it. So I think we know what the set of things are. The question is connections and building the institutional framework to make it work. Because the financing doesn't work, it doesn't work. If the regulatory regime doesn't work, and of course if you don't have roads, फिर बात मत करो उसके बाद. Sorry, Om. Yeah.
Thank you, Aru. Even though you said that you do not want to end with a depressing note, but the facts are very clear. The Bimar states continue to remain Bimar today. So that's what your ranking showed. The ranking of Bihar, which was the last in the bottom of the state, in almost every indicator continues to be there. That's one point. The second point I think we should really impress is that you are still using the 2011 data for most of the indicators. Using the data in 2019, the data for 2011, does not really make any sense.
Yeah.
But that is what our data system shows. There's nothing available after 2011. Nothing. 2015 really is not the census figure or the ancestral figure or the figures coming out of the government sources, but one source which really publishes the data from time to time, and that is the data that RO has used. That's one point. Surprisingly, the Niti Aayog came up with a report that is submitted to the UN system in 2018 on the SDG progress, using 69 or 68 indicators. I know more about SDG 11. For SDG 11, it used 4 indicators. And we just do not know where did they get the data from. This report shows, the data shows that the slum population in the country is 5.9%. There is no way in which our slum population could really be 5.9. And when you raise this issue with the Niti Aayog, they simply look at you. They do not answer this question. And we have been with the Niti Aayog. He has been missing those meetings for the past 6 weeks, but then some of us have been with the Niti Aayog. Let me make this remark, which I think might begin to affect all of this in due course of time. Niti Aayog is working on a plan, 15-year plan, 2020-2035. And another plan for 2035 to 2047, 47 because India would complete 100 years of its independence. The urban group, very, very small group, but there are 2 people from the IHS, the RO and Gotham, and some of us, just about 6, 7 people for the past 6 weeks now, just 6 weeks. It is amazing to see how this plan is being conceived at this point in time. I'm not getting into the mechanics of it, but simply some groups to produce a report by the 20th of November of this month with the fresh evidence, not really the evidence that we have at this point in time, that is 2011, producing data for 2016, 17, 18, and even 19 to show how much progress India has made over the past 5, 6, 7 years or so, the main objective being that one. Our struggle is that the layers of how the visions for the year 2035, which are those are 5 of them being fixed for the urban sector. That is, cities should be productive, cities should be inclusive, cities should be resilient, cities should be livable, and finally, cities should be well governed and well financed. And all of this to be supported with data, the more recent data, particularly of the data for 2017-18, whole lot of indicators for about 70%. We just don't know from where to draw this data, accepting the conversations that you have with some of the more prominent people within the Niti Aayog and so on and so forth. So this is the state of affairs at this point in time with respect to data production, data analysis. I do not know where did you get this data for 2014 with respect to inequalities, because once again our information is that the last figure that we got it was in 2011-12, after which the consumption figures, the MPC that we used to get every 5 years or so, they will stop coming in now. Thank you very much.
Thanks. No, you were not clear to some people at the back.
No, I was going to ask you
Yeah.
to hold the mic closer because people
Okay, so Om was basically saying that we have a data crisis. Yeah, we know that. The question, of course, there is, given the technology that we have, given the spread of institutions that work with data, academic institutions and otherwise, can we at least work a pragmatic proxy till our systems are sorted? I mean, we had a similar crisis in the 9th, 10th plan. There was a whole process, the World Bank put into money. I was part of that committee that tried to fix it. So we have this regular thing in any case, but now we have a much more serious crisis in some ways. But we have the wherewithal. So I think one of the open questions we have in each of the discussions are, if the public data system is not working as well as it could be, are there other ways of aggregating data? It doesn't matter. We can start with one state. We can start with 10 cities. We can start with transportation and actually build up. It could be crowdsourcing, other things. We have to be really innovative in trying to put this thing together. And of course, there will be big issues, because eventually it's like property information. The state has to own this thing, otherwise it won't have credibility. But at least you can create a framework which the state can then pick up and then replicate. And some state governments want to do it, others will not. Maybe the government eventually will do it. It depends on who gets caught with the fancy of trying to do something. I think this is a very critical question, because if you want to do stuff that's based on evidence, unfortunately you need data. I mean, you can tell a lot of stories and you can do metadata runs of 10,000 tweets and all that kind of stuff, but that doesn't add up to very much in some senses. So we obviously have to push, and some of us are doing that with the Registrar General, the new census and whatnot. But given the technology we have, we should be able to do polling of stuff every 6 months. And CMI and people like that do it, but a lot of that we work quite closely with CMI. We have access to the data. We have an open library here. People are able to use it. But then how many scholars are able to come in and look at the CMI data here because we have it here? That's a limitation. But we need to have, this is a place where we need some interesting partnerships to be built. And I'm sure some institutions and some people will try and do it. So let's start with a couple of places, either states or sectors. Try and see what we can do, pool our resources, and make sure this stuff becomes publicly available. Because the channels are available to hear this stuff. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that's there in mainline and otherwise would take this information forward. But if you don't have the data, well, minor problem. I mean, everybody's in trouble. Yeah, I mean, you have a vision, but too bad. It's all lost in translation, because you don't know whether you're going left, right, center, up, down. Thanks, Om, for that.